In the years leading up to the September 11, 2001, attacks, tensions between the United States and extremist groups in the Middle East were steadily escalating. The roots of this conflict can be traced back to a combination of historical, political, and religious factors that culminated in one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in modern history. Understanding the prelude to the September 11th attacks requires examining the rise of Al-Qaeda, the geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East, and the U.S. foreign policies that fueled resentment among radical Islamist factions. The formation of Al-Qaeda in the late 1980s played a pivotal role in shaping the events that would eventually lead to the September 11th attacks. Osama bin Laden, a wealthy Saudi Arabian with deep ties to influential families in the region, founded the group with the intent of creating a global jihadist network. Originally, Al-Qaeda's primary objective was to fight against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, with financial and military support from the United States and other Western allies. This unintended alliance, forged in the context of the Cold War, laid the foundation for a dangerous relationship that would backfire in the decades to come. After the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, bin Laden redirected Al-Qaeda's mission toward what he perceived as a greater threat: the United States and its presence in the Muslim world. His grievances were rooted in U.S. military involvement in the Middle East, particularly the stationing of American troops in Saudi Arabia following the Gulf War in 1991. To bin Laden and his followers, the presence of foreign soldiers in the land of Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, was a direct affront to Islamic values and an act of occupation. The 1990s saw a series of increasingly bold and deadly attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda against U.S. targets abroad. In 1993, a group linked to Al-Qaeda attempted to bring down the World Trade Center with a truck bomb, killing 6 people and injuring over 1,000. Though the attack failed to collapse the towers, it demonstrated Al-Qaeda's capacity for orchestrating large-scale terror operations. In 1998, simultaneous bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania killed hundreds, drawing global attention to the growing terrorist threat. In response, the United States launched missile strikes against suspected Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a facility in Sudan, but these actions did little to weaken the organization. Meanwhile, the Taliban, a fundamentalist Islamic regime, had seized power in Afghanistan in 1996, providing a safe haven for bin Laden and his followers. Al-Qaeda flourished under Taliban protection, establishing training camps and recruiting militants from around the world. Afghanistan became the operational base for planning and executing terrorist attacks. During this time, bin Laden issued several fatwas, religious decrees, declaring war on the United States, accusing it of supporting Israel, exploiting Middle Eastern resources, and killing Muslims through its military actions. As Al-Qaeda's network expanded, so did its ambitions. Bin Laden and his top lieutenants began conceptualizing a catastrophic attack that would strike at the very heart of American power, both symbolically and militarily. By the late 1990s, plans for what would become the September 11th attacks were already in motion. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, considered the chief architect of the attacks, proposed a complex operation involving hijacked airplanes used as weapons against iconic U.S. landmarks. Bin Laden approved the plan, recognizing its potential to cause unprecedented destruction and instill global fear. Despite warnings and signals picked up by U.S. intelligence agencies, the magnitude of Al-Qaeda's intentions remained underestimated. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, intelligence reports indicated that Al-Qaeda was preparing for a major operation, but the specifics were unclear. A notable instance occurred in August 2001, when a briefing to President George W. Bush explicitly warned of potential Al-Qaeda attacks on U.S. soil involving hijacked airplanes. However, bureaucratic challenges, interagency rivalry, and a lack of actionable intelligence hindered an effective response. Additionally, the cultural and political landscape of the late 20th century contributed to an atmosphere ripe for conflict. The Gulf War had left deep scars in the Middle East, and the continued U.S. support for Israel further inflamed anti-American sentiment in the region. Many Muslims viewed U.S. foreign policy as imperialist and exploitative, feeding into the radical narrative propagated by extremist groups like Al-Qaeda. In the United States, public awareness of the Al-Qaeda threat remained limited. Though the embassy bombings and the 2000 bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen drew media attention, few Americans grasped the scope of the danger. The U.S. government, while aware of the threat, struggled to adapt its national security apparatus to counter a decentralized, transnational terrorist network operating beyond traditional military battlefields. By the summer of 2001, Al-Qaeda's operatives were already in place, finalizing their preparations for the attacks. 19 hijackers, mostly from Saudi Arabia, had been recruited, trained, and deployed to the United States. They blended into American society, taking flight lessons at U.S. aviation schools and meticulously planning the operation's execution. The decision to target symbolic sites, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and possibly the U.S. Capitol, was calculated to maximize both physical destruction and psychological impact. The complex web of historical events, ideological motivations, and geopolitical struggles ultimately converged on September 11, 2001. The stage was set for an unprecedented act of terror that would change the course of U.S. history and reshape global politics for years to come. What began as a movement driven by ideological extremism evolved into a global threat that exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful nations. The attacks that followed would leave an indelible mark on the world, serving as a stark reminder of the destructive power of hatred, ideology, and unchecked fanaticism. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the world witnessed an unprecedented act of terrorism that would leave a lasting scar on global history. At approximately 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time, American Airlines Flight 11, a hijacked Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The initial explosion and resulting fireball sent plumes of smoke and debris into the air, sparking confusion and fear among witnesses on the ground and viewers around the world. Many believed it was a tragic accident, unaware that this was only the beginning of a coordinated terrorist operation. Just 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, also a hijacked Boeing 767, struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center. The horrifying collision was broadcast live on television, dispelling any remaining doubt that the United States was under attack. The second impact created a massive explosion, showering the streets of Lower Manhattan with flaming debris and trapping hundreds of people above the impact zone. First responders, including firefighters, police officers, and emergency medical personnel, rushed to the scene, risking their lives to evacuate the towers and assist the injured. As the nation grappled with the unfolding crisis in New York, another attack took place at 9:37 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77, a hijacked Boeing 757, crashed into the western side of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The collision caused a massive fire and extensive structural damage to the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. The attack further heightened the nation's sense of vulnerability, confirming that the terrorists were targeting critical symbols of American power and infrastructure. Meanwhile, aboard United Airlines Flight 93, passengers and crew members learned about the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon through phone calls to loved ones. Realizing that their plane was also hijacked and likely intended for another high-profile target, possibly the U.S. Capitol or the White House, the passengers made a courageous decision. Led by individuals such as Todd Beamer, Mark Bingham, and others, they mounted a desperate counterattack against the hijackers. Their heroic efforts caused the plane to crash into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at 10:03 a.m., thwarting the terrorists' plans but costing the lives of everyone on board. Back in New York, the situation grew increasingly dire. The intense fires caused by the jet fuel-fed explosions in the Twin Towers weakened the building's steel frames. At 9:59 a.m., less than an hour after being struck, the South Tower collapsed in a massive cloud of smoke, dust, and debris, sending shockwaves through the city. Thousands of emergency responders and civilians in the area were caught in the deadly fallout as they fled for safety. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower also collapsed after burning for 102 minutes. The iconic structures, once symbols of economic power and modern architecture, were reduced to smoldering ruins. The collapse generated seismic tremors that were detected miles away and left a landscape of twisted metal, pulverized concrete, and shattered lives. The human toll of the attacks was staggering. Nearly 3,000 people were killed, including passengers and crew members aboard the hijacked planes, workers in the World Trade Center, Pentagon employees, and heroic first responders. Thousands more were injured, and countless families were forever changed by the loss of their loved ones. Survivors who escaped the towers described harrowing scenes of chaos, darkness, and desperate struggle as they navigated smoke-filled stairwells and debris-laden hallways. The immediate aftermath of the attacks saw an outpouring of grief, solidarity, and patriotism across the United States and around the world. Vigils, memorials, and moments of silence were held as people grappled with the scale of the tragedy. The images of firefighters raising the American flag amid the wreckage became symbols of resilience and determination in the face of unspeakable horror. September 11, 2001, stands as a day of unimaginable loss but also of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. The events of that morning revealed both the darkest depths of human cruelty and the highest peaks of heroism. It was a moment that forever altered the trajectory of the United States, reshaping its national identity, security policies, and place in the world. The immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks plunged the United States into a state of national emergency, prompting swift responses from both federal and local authorities. In the hours and days following the attacks, rescue and recovery operations were launched on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of first responders, including firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and volunteers, converged on Ground Zero in New York City, risking their lives to search for survivors amidst the smoking wreckage of the World Trade Center. The rescue efforts were marked by extraordinary acts of bravery and sacrifice. Emergency personnel worked around the clock despite hazardous conditions, including unstable debris, toxic smoke, and fires that continued to burn for weeks. In total, more than 400 first responders lost their lives while trying to save others, making September 11th the deadliest day in U.S. law enforcement and firefighting history. Survivors were pulled from the rubble in the hours after the attacks, though hopes of finding additional survivors faded as the days wore on. At the Pentagon, emergency crews battled intense flames and worked tirelessly to secure the damaged sections of the building. Military personnel and civilian employees aided in the rescue and recovery operations, demonstrating resilience even as they grieved the loss of colleagues. Similarly, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, investigators and recovery teams combed the crash site of United Airlines Flight 93, piecing together evidence from the plane's shattered remains. In the wake of the attacks, the U.S. government took immediate steps to respond to the crisis and prevent further acts of terrorism. On the evening of September 11th, President George W. Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office, condemning the attacks and vowing that the United States would pursue those responsible. His resolute declaration that terrorism against our nation will not stand set the stage for a new era of U.S. foreign and domestic policy. One of the earliest government actions was grounding all commercial flights across the United States, the first nationwide grounding in U.S. aviation history. This unprecedented move effectively shut down air travel for several days while security protocols were re-evaluated and strengthened. International flights were diverted to Canada, where thousands of passengers were housed by communities that opened their homes and shelters. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA and FBI, launched an intensive investigation into the attacks. Within days, Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization led by Osama bin Laden, was identified as the mastermind behind the operation. Evidence linking the hijackers to Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan prompted a global manhunt for those involved in the plot. As the investigation unfolded, the U.S. government mobilized its military forces. On September 14, 2001, President Bush visited Ground Zero, standing atop a pile of rubble alongside firefighters and rescue workers. In an impromptu address using a bullhorn, he delivered a defiant message that resonated across the country. The people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon. 3 days later, on September 17th, Wall Street reopened after its longest closure since the Great Depression. Despite fears of economic collapse, the stock market demonstrated resilience, though the attacks ultimately caused billions of dollars in economic damage. Industries such as airlines, tourism, and insurance faced devastating losses, while national security-related sectors saw increased funding and attention. The U.S. Congress acted swiftly to provide support and security measures. On September 18, 2001, Congress authorized the use of military force against those responsible for the attacks, laying the legal foundation for the War on Terror. The authorization for use of military force, AUMF, granted the President broad powers to combat terrorism globally. Congress also approved a $40 billion emergency relief package to fund recovery efforts, provide aid to victims' families, and bolster national security. At the same time, global reactions were overwhelmingly supportive of the United States. Allies expressed solidarity and pledged cooperation in combating terrorism. NATO invoked Article 5 of its charter for the first time in history, declaring that an attack against one member was an attack against all. This unprecedented move underscored the gravity of the situation and paved the way for international military action. The attacks also had profound social and cultural repercussions. Across the United States, candlelight vigils, prayer services, and public memorials were held in honor of the victims. The phrase, "Never Forget," became a national rallying cry, symbolizing the collective determination to remember the lives lost and to stand united against terrorism. The aftermath of September 11th marked a turning point in American history. The attacks galvanized the nation, inspiring acts of heroism, resilience, and unity. However, they also set in motion a series of far-reaching policies and decisions that would reshape the global political landscape for years to come. From intensified airport security and surveillance measures to the launch of military campaigns abroad, the legacy of September 11th continues to influence the course of world events. The long-term impact of the September 11th attacks reshaped not only the United States but also the global political and security landscape. In the wake of the attacks, the U.S. government launched a comprehensive campaign known as the War on Terror, targeting terrorist organizations and the nations that harbored them. This response fundamentally altered U.S. foreign and domestic policy, initiating military conflicts, expanding surveillance programs, and redefining national security. One of the earliest and most significant consequences was the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001. The objective was to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime that provided the terrorist group with a safe haven. Operation Enduring Freedom quickly toppled the Taliban government, but the conflict evolved into a prolonged war as insurgent forces regrouped. The war in Afghanistan became America's longest military engagement, lasting 2 decades until U.S. troops officially withdrew in August 2021. The War on Terror also extended to Iraq, despite the absence of direct links between Iraq and the September 11th attacks. In March 2003, the U.S. and its allies invaded Iraq, citing the threat of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and the possibility of terrorism. While Saddam Hussein's regime was overthrown, the invasion destabilized the region, leading to years of sectarian violence, the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, and a contentious global debate over the war's legitimacy. Domestically, the attacks prompted a significant expansion of government powers aimed at preventing future acts of terrorism. The USA Patriot Act, enacted in October 2001, granted broad surveillance and investigative authorities to U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies. It enabled the collection of phone records, email communications, and financial transactions in efforts to disrupt potential terrorist plots. While supporters argued that these measures were essential for national security, critics raised concerns about privacy violations and government overreach. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, was established in 2002, consolidating 22 federal agencies into a single entity focused on safeguarding the U.S. from various threats. The creation of the DHS marked one of the largest government reorganizations in American history. The agency took charge of critical areas such as border security, immigration enforcement, and emergency response coordination. Air travel was also permanently transformed after September 11th. The Transportation Security Administration, TSA, was created to oversee airport security, introducing rigorous screening procedures that became routine for travelers worldwide. New protocols included stricter luggage checks, body scans, and no-fly lists designed to prevent potential threats from boarding airplanes. The attacks reshaped international relations, fostering closer cooperation between the U.S. and its allies in counter-terrorism efforts. Countries around the world strengthened their security policies and intelligence-sharing networks to combat global terrorism. NATO invoked Article 5 of its founding treaty for the first time, declaring that the attacks on the U.S. constituted an attack on all member states, leading to NATO's military involvement in Afghanistan. The socio-political impact of the attacks also extended into cultural and societal spheres. In the United States, public sentiment gravitated toward national unity, patriotism, and support for military personnel. However, the post-9/11 era also saw a rise in discrimination and hate crimes, particularly against Muslim and Middle Eastern communities, fueled by misconceptions linking them to terrorism. Commemorating the tragedy became a central aspect of American collective memory. The National September 11th Memorial and Museum was established at Ground Zero in New York City, honoring the nearly 3,000 lives lost. The annual observance of Patriot Day on September 11th features ceremonies, moments of silence, and remembrances across the country. The legacy of September 11th continues to shape modern policies and global security strategies. Counterterrorism efforts remain a top priority for many nations, with intelligence agencies evolving to address emerging threats such as cyberterrorism and lone wolf attacks. Military interventions in the Middle East have left lasting geopolitical consequences, contributing to ongoing conflicts and humanitarian crises. In retrospect, September 11th was more than a single tragic day. It was a transformative event that redefined the 21st century. It exposed vulnerabilities, prompted unparalleled responses, and demonstrated the resilience of nations in the face of adversity. Its lessons continue to inform policies, guide military strategies, and influence the global fight against terrorism today.